I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt weak and heavy. My fingers were trembling, and I couldn't control my breathing. The noise around me sounded far away, like I was underwater. I could see shoes moving past me, but none of them stopped. A woman I didn't know knelt beside me. She kept asking if I could hear her. I nodded slightly, even though my vision kept going dark. Someone called for medical help. I felt embarrassed, but I was also scared. My chest felt tight, like something was squeezing it from the inside. I searched the crowd for familiar faces. I needed someone to hold my hand, to say I was going to be okay. Instead, I saw my family standing at a distance. They looked uncomfortable, almost annoyed. No one ran toward me. No one shouted my name. When the paramedics arrived, they lifted me onto a stretcher. As they carried me away, I turned my head one last time. My family didn't follow. They stayed where they were. Inside the ambulance, I stared at the bright lights above me and felt something break inside. It wasn't just my body giving out. It was the hope that maybe, one day, they would show up for me. That day, I stopped expecting it. At home, I learned early not to ask for much. If I needed school supplies, I figured out how to get them myself. If I had a problem, I kept it quiet. It was easier that way. Whenever I tried to share something important, the conversation would quickly turn back to my siblings. Dinner was usually about game schedules or upcoming competitions. Weekends were spent at tournaments and award ceremonies. I went along, clapping and smiling, even when I had exams the next morning. When I mentioned it, I was told I was responsible enough to handle it on my own. On report card day, my grades were expected. No celebration, no special dinner. Just a simple nod and a reminder to keep it up. If I ever felt tired or overwhelmed, I was told I was strong and capable. It sounded like a compliment, but it felt like a warning not to complain. I started working part-time earlier than most of my classmates. Not because I wanted extra spending money, but because I knew it would make things easier for everyone. I paid for my own school trips and saved for college applications. No one asked how I managed it. They just assumed I would. Over time, I stopped sharing my wins and my worries. I became quiet, careful, and independent. It wasn't because I didn't need support. It was because I understood I wouldn't get it. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't difficult. I was simply the one who didn't take up space. My days started before sunrise and ended long after dark. I would go from classes straight to work, standing for hours with barely any breaks. By the time I got home, my body felt drained, but I still had assignments waiting for me. The chest pain began as a small pressure. I told myself it was nothing. I blamed it on lack of sleep and too much coffee. But the pressure slowly turned into sharp pain that would stop me in the middle of whatever I was doing. Sometimes I had to lean against a wall and pretend I was just checking my phone until it passed. I didn't tell anyone else after that first conversation. I didn't want to hear that I was overreacting. So I learned how to hide it. When my heart started racing, I would take slow breaths and force a smile. At work, I stayed busy so no one would notice when I felt lightheaded. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting my heartbeat. It didn't feel normal, but I convinced myself I just needed to push through a little longer. Graduation was close. Once I finished, I thought I could finally rest. There were moments when I wanted to admit I was scared. I wanted someone to tell me it was okay to slow down. Instead, I kept everything inside. I handled my pain the same way I handled everything else, quietly and alone. By the end of the semester, I wasn't just tired. I was running on empty, pretending I was fine. I woke up before dawn, my head pounding and my body aching from no sleep. My eyes were heavy, but I forced myself to get dressed. The gown felt stiff and itchy, and I could barely keep my balance. I kept telling myself to smile, even though the room spun around me. By the time my family arrived, I was already exhausted. They came in rushing, carrying bags and arguing quietly about where to park. My mother, Delaney, kept checking her hair in the mirror, while Brenna fussed over her outfit, saying it needed to look perfect for the photos. My brother Kellen barely glanced at me, distracted by his phone. Before we left, they reminded me again to behave, to not make a scene, and to smile like everything was fine. I nodded and said I would. even though inside I felt weak and overwhelmed. I wanted them to see how hard I had worked, but I already knew their attention was on appearances, not on me. The drive to the venue was tense. They argued about directions and parking fees, making me feel invisible even in the back seat. I clutched my diploma folder tightly, trying to steady my trembling hands. My chest felt tight, and I ignored the small, sharp pains that had been creeping in all week. When we finally arrived, they hustled me out of the car, adjusting their clothes and snapping a few quick pictures. I smiled for the camera, pretending I was excited and proud. But inside, I felt a hollow ache, knowing that my family cared more about the show than about me. I took a deep breath, told myself to keep going, and stepped toward the ceremony, feeling more alone than ever. I felt the room tilt, like the floor was slipping away under me. My legs gave out, and suddenly I was falling. The noise of the crowd faded into a dull roar, and everything felt heavy and unreal. I reached out, hoping to grab something, anything, but my hands only met empty air. Strangers were the first to react. Hands caught me, voices asking if I was okay, and someone pressed a cold hand to my forehead. Their concern was immediate, gentle, and real. For a moment, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't with my own family. Then I looked toward them. My mother stood frozen, face pale, whispering to Kellen to stay calm. Brenna rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath about how I was making a scene, and that this was going to ruin the ceremony. My father didn't move at all, just watched from a few steps away. Hearing those words hurt more than the sudden jolt of hitting the floor. It was the realization that the people I loved, the ones I expected to be there for me, were more worried about appearances than about me. Their hesitation, their judgment, their lack of action. It cut deeper than any physical pain. The paramedics arrived quickly, lifting me gently onto a stretcher. Strangers held my hand, reassured me, and stayed close. My family followed at a distance, silent and uncomfortable, offering nothing but awkward glances. Lying there, my chest still aching, I understood something important. Support doesn't come from blood alone. It comes from people willing to step in when you're at your weakest. That day, the truth about my family became crystal clear, and it burned sharper than any fall. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and worry. I was hooked up to monitors, my body weak and trembling. The doctors explained that my heart was under strain from exhaustion. I hadn't allowed myself to notice. They said I needed rest, care, and time. Things I had never really given myself. My family came to visit once, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Delaney asked polite questions, her voice quiet, while Brenna tapped her foot impatiently. Kellen barely looked at me, checking his watch constantly. They stayed for only a few minutes, offering half-hearted sympathy and quick advice I didn't need. When the nurse said I could go home, my family left almost immediately. Kellen had practice, Brenna had an appointment, and my mother had errands. They didn't offer to help with anything, not even to make sure I had a ride or someone to check on me. I nodded, told them I would manage, and watched them leave. Alone in the room, I finally let myself feel the exhaustion and fear I had been hiding. The silence was heavy, but it also felt honest. No one was pretending, no one was watching. They had shown me exactly where I stood in their priorities. I realized then that my survival and my care were my responsibility. I couldn't rely on anyone else to notice my struggles or step in when I needed help. That truth stung, but it also planted a seed of resolve. I would take control of my life, my health, and my future, because no one else would. Lying in that hospital bed, I promised myself I would never put my well-being in the hands of people who only saw me as an obligation or an inconvenience. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I had spent too many years hoping for their care, waiting for them to notice my struggles, and feeling hurt when they didn't. In that moment, I decided I would never beg them to care again. Once I got home, I started making changes. I reached out quietly to professional contacts I had built during college. I transferred my job applications, references, and networking connections to opportunities in another state. I wanted a fresh start, far from the shadow of a family that had shown me they couldn't be relied on. I found an apartment on my own and packed only what I needed. Moving was hard, not because of the distance, but because it felt like I was leaving behind the life I had always known. The life I thought I was supposed to share with them. But I reminded myself that independence was worth the loneliness. I also cut financial ties. I stopped relying on family for anything, and I made sure they knew I could manage without them. Bills, rent, groceries, even emergencies, I would handle them myself. It was empowering to realize that I could survive and even thrive without them. For the first time, I felt a quiet strength I hadn't known before. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about reclaiming control over my own life. I would no longer let anyone dictate my value or decide whether I deserved care. I would build my world on my own terms, and I would do it without them. That decision was simple, but it changed everything. From that day forward, I was no longer waiting. I was moving forward. Starting over in Denver was harder than I expected, but it was mine. I found a small apartment and furnished it with only what I needed. Everything I had I earned or saved myself. No one helped me, but I didn't expect it anymore. I began seeing a therapist to deal with years of stress, neglect, and quiet resentment. Talking through everything I had bottled up felt strange at first, but slowly it lifted some of the weight I had carried for so long. I learned how to set boundaries, how to trust myself, and how to stop waiting for people who wouldn't show up. Work became my anchor. I got a stable job that challenged me but also gave me security. I worked hard, sometimes long hours, but every paycheck was mine. I learned to manage money, save carefully, and plan for emergencies. I wasn't rich, but I was independent. For the first time, I relied only on myself. I cooked my own meals, cleaned my apartment, and handled problems without looking for approval or support from anyone else. The freedom felt strange but also powerful. I realized I could survive and even thrive without family involvement. I made friends slowly, people who respected me and treated me with kindness. I stopped expecting validation from my family and started celebrating my own victories, no matter how small. Every small success, paying rent on time, finishing a big project, even buying a winter coat, felt like a victory I had achieved alone. By the end of the first year, I felt stronger, calmer, and more in control than ever. I had built a life entirely on my own, and it was steady, real, and mine. I had learned I didn't need anyone else to survive, and that knowledge was priceless. The life I built in Denver grew steady and quiet, but the silence from my family was always there, like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Days passed, weeks passed, and slowly, years went by. For 3 years, I heard almost nothing from them. Birthdays came and went with short, dry messages, never asking how I was or sharing anything beyond a polite, happy birthday. At first it stung. I would pause over their messages, hoping for warmth or interest, but there was none. No calls to check on me, no concern for my achievements, nothing. I realized they weren't going to reach out, and I had to let go of hoping. I poured myself into my work, my apartment, my routines. I celebrated my own victories, sometimes quietly alone, sometimes with friends who actually cared. Therapy had taught me how to process feelings without needing approval from people who never offered it. I learned that waiting for their recognition or concern was wasted energy. The emptiness I felt toward them wasn't as sharp anymore. Instead, it became a kind of clarity. I understood that their absence wasn't about me. It was about who they were. I had built a life that didn't rely on them, and that independence became my shield. Even with the silence, I grew stronger. I learned to trust myself completely. I knew I could handle problems, celebrate successes, and face hardships without expecting anything from them. Their absence was no longer a wound. It was proof that I could thrive entirely on my own. By the end of those years, the quiet around me didn't feel empty. It felt like space to grow, to succeed, and to finally live on my own terms, free from the weight of their neglect. Years of quiet independence had made me strong, but nothing prepared me for the day the tables quietly turned. Kellen's promising career ended abruptly after an injury. The dreams he had built since high school, the scholarships, the awards, the recognition, they all vanished in an instant. Suddenly, the golden boy who had always been praised for his talent and charm was struggling. Medical bills piled up faster than he could handle. His treatments were expensive, and insurance barely covered anything. Our father's business, once a source of pride, began to falter. Garrick made desperate calls, trying to save what he had worked for decades, but nothing seemed to go right. In contrast, I was building steadily. My apartment, my savings, my stable job. They weren't flashy, but they were real. I had no help, no safety net, and no one to lean on, but I had resilience and planning. Slowly, my name started to carry weight in ways it never had in my family. I was no longer the quiet one, or the invisible daughter. I was the one who could pay bills, handle emergencies, and make tough decisions. It was strange, seeing my family struggle in ways they never imagined for themselves. There was no gloating in me, no celebration of their misfortune. But the contrast was undeniable. I had built a life on my own, while the ones who once ignored me were now asking themselves how they could survive. For the first time, I felt a sense of quiet vindication. Not out of revenge yet, but from knowing I had taken control, survived, and thrived when no one else had believed in me. The balance had shifted, and for the first time, I was no longer the one left behind. It happened one rainy afternoon. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed my mother's name. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity won. When I answered, I heard her sobbing. Delaney's voice shook as she explained their situation. Kellen's medical bills were overwhelming, Garrick's business was failing, and they didn't know how to make it through the month. I didn't know who else to call, she said, her voice trembling. Family helps family. Hearing that line made something twist inside me. The same woman who had walked past me when I collapsed at graduation. The same woman who had whispered to Kellen to stay calm while I struggled on the floor, was now asking me for help. It was surreal, almost unbelievable. I listened quietly as she listed the bills, the overdue rent, and Kellen's mounting hospital costs. She pleaded, trying to make it sound like they had no choice. I could hear Brenna in the background, urging her to ask for more, to push harder. For a moment, I felt an old tug of guilt, the kind I had felt as a child when I wished my family cared. But it was fleeting. I had built my life without them, piece by piece, and I wasn't about to undo that. I asked them questions calmly, letting them explain everything. I stayed quiet, taking in the irony of it all. They had ignored me when I needed them most. Now they were relying on me, expecting support, expecting loyalty, expecting forgiveness. It was my turn to choose. And in that moment, I realized I didn't have to answer the way they wanted. I could stand firm. I could hold my ground. I could finally decide what they deserved, and it didn't have to be what they expected. I stayed silent for a moment, listening to their urgent voices, their pleas, their shaky explanations. I didn't raise mine. I didn't insult them. I didn't give them the satisfaction of hearing me angry. Instead, I spoke calmly, every word measured. I remember graduation day, I said softly. I remember how I collapsed, how I struggled to stand, and how strangers rushed to help me while my own family stood back. I remember who actually cared when I needed it most. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear them swallowing, trying to find words, but none came. I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel, even for a moment, the weight of what they had done, or not done. I hope you find the same independence you always admired in me, I continued. I hope you learn what it's like to rely on yourself and fight your own battles, because that's what I had to do. I hope you understand how it feels to be left behind when it matters most. I felt steady, grounded in a way I never had before. My hands weren't trembling. My chest didn't tighten. I could hear their desperation, but it didn't shake me. I had survived alone. I had built a life on my own terms. I had become stronger than I had ever been when I depended on them. Finally, I hung up. The line went quiet. I didn't feel relief, and I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to care. I wasn't hoping for approval, forgiveness, or recognition. I had taken control of my life, and that control was mine alone. And in that moment, I realized something powerful. I had won, not by revenge, not by spite, but by simply surviving, thriving, and refusing to let them define my worth.
Some stories don't end, they follow you. If this one stayed in your mind, you know what to do.